Hi, this is John Romano, and this is my lecture, Changing Women's Roles Across the Middle Ages, for my course on medieval history. Now, discussing medieval women is a theme that really presents a fundamental stumbling block in the way of an historian. The implication of saying that you can study the quote-unquote medieval woman is that really that women had anything in common. But in effect, a medieval noblewoman would have had really very little connection, her experience, to that of a peasant woman. Or, in fact, Christian and Jewish women also would have had extremely different experiences. But this division could occur between women in class, religion, age, marital status, and by the specific place and period in which they lived. If it is possible to speak about some common patterns that transcended all of these specific differences, I would say that there are two. First of all, I would say that as a group, women tended to be viewed as inferior to men in the Middle Ages in Europe. This was a civilization that really was patriarchal in nature. Second of all, there were certainly some individual women who could overcome this inferior status and really completely break the rules assigned to their sex. But you should not take this to mean that all women could do this, or in fact even most women. There, of course, are very extraordinary examples of women who do not necessarily stand for the experience of the vast majority of them. We might also, before we get into specific periods, said that there are at least some patterns that tend to cut across the Middle Ages when it comes to women's experience. Women, on the whole, were very important for powerful families because alliances would be forged through marriage. And you're seeing, for instance, the joining of hands by a bishop of two people in marriage here. Women also, especially again those women who are noble, who had the resources, would often be participants in gift giving, for instance, sometimes to their favorite church or monastery. Women could often serve as patrons of artists. Women, of course, were also seen as important to both bear and to rear children. Some women, too, as we've seen, especially in times where men are off fighting, it is often women who have to take over the position of ruling over households in their husband's absence, and again, in some cases, having to cut all sorts of business deals. In early Christianity, women often took leadership roles. This is, for instance, so-called orans, or praying position of an early woman in the early Christian community. And we know, in fact, that some of the earliest adherents of Christianity were women and devoted a lot of their time and money to the faith. And we do know that there is clearly in certain points in Scripture there were egalitarian notions about men and women. One of the famous passages, for instance, is Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, which would seem to imply that within the Christian community, men and women should be the same. As least as this verse was interpreted in the Middle Ages, they would say that yes, there is true equality coming, but really that would be reserved for the next life, for the afterlife. Theological texts do state that women have a common spiritual destiny and dignity before God. And in fact, they never state that women were ever the property of a husband. At least when it came to Christian law, both a man and a woman would have to freely consent to the marriage. A woman could not, at least on a theoretical level, be forced to be married. And women had their own legal personality separate from a man. Really, they're supposed to, once a man and woman are married, they're supposed to be spiritually equal. Again, I use the term theoretically because in many cases, women had very little choice as to whom they would actually marry, and so the consent really could not be exercised as much as might have been desirable. We also see all kinds of examples of women taking a very active role in religion. Really, the process that we saw at the beginning of this course, of conversion from paganism to Christianity, we think women often played a major role in this. One of the people, for instance, who we've mentioned before, but bears repeating, is the mother of the first Christian emperor, Constantine, his mother, Helen, who was really said to be instrumental in the decision of Constantine to convert to Christianity. And as many of you know too, Helen was also seen to have traveled to Jerusalem, and supposedly she was able to find a piece of the true cross, the cross that Jesus had been crucified on. And there are other women who played a similar role. One we mentioned too was Clotilde, who supposedly again had a role in Clovis's conversion. And these, of course, are examples of very elevated people in society. It is probably the case, although we can't prove it, on a lesser level too. Women would sometimes be the major influence in trying to get men to convert to Christianity as well. Of course, the other, maybe the major role that women played as regards religion was those who chose to go into the religious life to become nuns. These were women who were said to have been married to God, to Jesus. And really, these women had a particularly special status, said to be really having gained power through their virginity, and their prayers were seen to be much more powerful than the prayers of average people. Women's status would have been determined in part in the Middle Ages by their age and their marital status, and really to some degree there would have been different behavioral expectations and social norms for girls and maidens than for married women and widows. I should say that really altogether we think that the vast majority of women who did not go into the religious life would end up being married at one point or another. And in effect, there at times was even pressure put upon widows to remarry after the death of their husbands. It was sometimes seen as something of an anomalous status for women to be unattached with any men. And I really just show you here, this is an image of the Holy Family with Mary and baby Jesus in what appears to be something like a medieval version of a walker. In examining the question of how women's experience was like in the Middle Ages, historians face all sorts of problems with our source material. Almost all medieval sources are written by men and really tend to reflect their viewpoint. Really, when many of these men, who were often in the church, report on women, they tended to have anti-women viewpoints. So, and in particular, sometimes the sort of bad role model for women was sometimes seen as Eve, depicted here in a medieval cathedral. And sometimes women were thought to similarly have vices like Eve, be referred to as daughters of Eve. And we really see throughout the Middle Ages there's a long tradition of misogynist preaching against the supposed vices that women in particular had. Women were self-willed, disobedient, weak, deceitful, or untrustworthy. And interestingly enough, very often women were seen of the two genders to be the more lustful. In fact, some women were seen to have an insatiable sexual appetite. And really, they were seen as really being guided by that and their emotions far more than men. And really, of the two genders, men were seen to be the ones who used their reason more, had to provide guidance for women. And again, in some cases, this could be all of these vices could be used for a justification for spousal abuse, for physically disciplining one's wife, or else that she would get out of hand. So whereas there's this one tendency to be very misogynistic toward women, there's also a second and contradictory impulse in some of our sources that tend to idealize women, to put them on a pedestal. So, for instance, in the literature of chivalry, think of King Arthur, for instance, women are seen as fair, as unapproachable, as perfect, almost. And of all women, of course, the one who was seen to be most perfect was, of course, the Virgin Mary, who by far was the most important saint who was venerated in the Middle Ages. And again, this of course does show that people certainly were willing to afford some women a very special status. Although, as some scholars have pointed out, Mary occupied a position that no ordinary woman could possibly do, in that she could simultaneously be both a virgin and a mother. We also know, of course, that there are all sorts of other female saints who were venerated. And just one we've seen in this course, for instance, this is Saint Faith again. And altogether, there were far fewer female than male saints. The ratio is probably around 80% male saints and around 20% female saints. While, again, it is important to recognize that there is this veneration going on, most people, by the same token, would say that this really, looking at the connection people had with these female saints, doesn't necessarily tell us much about the everyday experience of most women. Finally, on just again another problem of the sources, we do certainly have some documents by women. We've read, for instance, Duoda's handbook earlier, a portion of that in the course. This is a famous literary scholar and writer, Christine de Pizan. And there are certain women like this who are noble, who are literate, and who are productive. But some people would say, of course, that that is in and of itself a problem, in as much as the vast majority of people generally, and women too, were illiterate. And so you cannot necessarily take the experience of a very rich and literate woman to be the experience of all women. What I'd like to do now to be able to break down more about the concrete experience of women in the Middle Ages is to break down the Middle Ages into three very broad periods, starting with the early Middle Ages from around 500 to 1000. We've already spoken about the early Middle Ages as a time politically of decentralization and a relatively low standard of living. And this was, some have argued, a situation that for women would really bring both dangers and opportunities. And for the vast majority of this period, in the absence of a sort of a strong central authority, women could be vulnerable to sexual assault, exploitation, and these coming from either those living around them normally or by invaders. But in those circumstances, too, we also see at least some women who manage to carve out positions of power. And in particular, we tend to think in this period of abbesses enjoying a position of relative strength. And these women, as all monks, were admired for their asceticism. And in many cases, abbesses would actually counsel certain lords or rulers we know of. And really, in some cases, they would be responsible for instance, distributing charity, keeping hospitals running, and caring for sacred relics. And in fact, within nunneries and female monasteries, these were often places of education where many women could learn to read and write. And in effect, we know that really there are probably a lot more literate nuns who produced manuscripts than we know of. The assumption has always been, when you see a manuscript, that it had to have been written by a man, but in fact, that is a false assumption. We see that in some places, what is referred to as cloister schools grew up. And cloister schools were within monasteries. In some cases, the nuns would teach rich young women to read. And in fact, they could read and write. And really, in some cases, one can only wonder about how happy some of these very educated women would have been later on to end up being wedded to men who really grew up in a very hyper-masculine culture that prized war above all else. And in fact, in most cases, in the early Middle Ages, many of these noble women would have been far better educated than their husbands. As I mentioned to you earlier, though, we do think that there were real dangers for the often stateless sort of position of government in the early Middle Ages, and probably women disproportionately suffered at the hands, for instance, of some of the invaders we've discussed, whether it be Vikings, Muslims, or Magyars. And again, among the other stories that talk about the horrors that perpetuated on people during this period, we do have stories of women having been dragged through the streets by their hair, having been tortured, having been raped. In one particularly brutal story, for instance, from the early Middle Ages, we know of the abbess Ebba, who had a convent in Ely in England. And at one point, a Danish group of Vikings surrounded this monastery, and Ebba feared that in addition to simply losing all their precious objects, these Vikings would also violate them. And so she ordered her nuns to slash off their noses and their upper lips, so they would be so horrifying that the Vikings wouldn't want to get close to them. And as the rest of the story goes, in fact, the Vikings simply decided upon seeing this to burn the monastery, which also had the effect of killing all its inhabitants. We see in the early Middle Ages, too, that there were many queens who had positions of significant influence. including France, which of course we've spent a lot of time on. And we said in particular in the Merovingian dynasty of France, in many cases, women were some of the controlling influences of the dynasty, really being just as involved with all sorts of political intrigues as men. And perhaps really this was in part because this was still a time in which men could divorce their wives. So it was very important that these queens made sure that they continued to have personal influence. When we talk about the Carolingians, we can see that queens actually begin to actually receive their own form of royal anointing alongside their husbands. And in fact, we know that bishops would say prayers that were specifically for women, involving, for instance, their fertility, because they had to produce heirs for the dynasty. And in many cases, we know of when the Carolingian queens had the duty of taking care of the royal estates when Carolingian men were off fighting battles. Taking care, for instance, of the household finances, various domestic affairs, which then again freed up the king for fighting in part, but also for hunting is another thing that men in the Carolingian era would often take part in. And this same sort of tendency, because just like all things Carolingian, would be imitated in the rest of Western Europe. Women at the lower end of the social spectrum, we think, would also have a central role in the economy. And we really see, in fact, that there are certain gender-specific tasks that become just associated with women. So, for instance, taking part in a domestic service, milling grain, brewing beer, cooking and cleaning, helping in the vineyards sometimes, occasionally, taking part in harvest, where again it was particularly important that sometimes the harvest be brought in quickly. Women would also collect berries in the forest and produce cloth. So really a spectrum of different roles in the economy. With the growth of feudalism, we think that in many cases we see that women play just as important a role of men in desperately trying to keep alive their families in a changing world. And really, again, in particular, trying to hold on to land, which, as feudalism progressed, was often the only real source of power. So in many cases, women, just as much as men, would be lords over landed property. They own their own castles at times. We know of women who had the rights of justice. In some cases, women who would actually command other knights militarily, would found their own churches, and would, in some cases, just as men did, appoint church officials. And we really see that, just as before, because certain noble women could bring dowries, they could bring familial connections. We really see that in many cases they are pawns that help their own families to advance. But really, in this circumstance, we do not think there was, as a whole, any effective barriers to the exercise of power by women, not in the least. We turn now to the period from 1000 to 1300, a period that we've said already was an area of renewal, an area in which, especially when it comes to agriculture, we'd said first, was a revolutionary time. And really, women were certainly a part of this. They help with the farming, and really, in many cases, as farms begin to grow in size, we see that in many cases women were simply left to do some of the farming while men went off to gain new lands, to clear forests, for instance. Whereas so women sometimes would just be doing the majority of the agricultural work. We also see altogether, we think that I mentioned to you that um, as a whole in this period, there was better nutrition for everyone. Specifically, we think that more female children were surviving out of childhood because in times where there was more scarcity, it was particularly girls who were dying in larger numbers because there was always favoritism given to male children. Women, generally speaking, were not allowed to take part in guilds, but that is not to say that they were not significant for the economy at this time. And in fact, that women often would participate in home workshops. So, for instance, in certain technical processes, like, for instance, the fulling of cloth, using mills, tanning, laundering, polishing, all these things, really beginning producing pigments, for instance. All of these things, and really, in some ways, in some cases, in these sort of small-scale family workshops, marriages appear to us to be almost like business partnerships, where they would, both of them together, the man and wife would produce a whole range of trade-worthy products that then could be brought to market. And really, in many examples, we see that women could have a significant role, for instance, in brewing beer and making glass and making textiles. Women could go out and sell fish, and they could at least serve as associates of their husbands in some of the heavier industries of this period: coopering, smithing, tanning, salt panning. And really, we think that at least some of these household workshops that were successful, both genders had a flexible division of labor between women and men. With all of that being said, you should not think that women had the same sort of opportunities open to them during this period of time. And so, for instance, one of the things that we said was one of the great changes during this time period was that there was a new university culture that grew up. Women were entirely excluded from attending universities. The only way in which they had any part in it was on the margins as prostitutes, but they're certainly not anyone who were actually allowed to attend classes or anything like that, or actually be in university culture. We also think, too, during this period that as the church began to stress reform and began to stress, as a subset of that, that priests were supposed to remain celibate. We think that in many cases, women who had been the wives of priests or had been the companions of priests without the formal blessing of marriage begin to get portrayed in a far more evil light than before as temptresses. And in fact, we know some cases in which the priests were really watched over much more carefully. They could no longer engage in this kind of activity. And people who had previously been priests' wives or companions were reduced to servants. So they no longer had that role. We also found that in many cases in this period, women would find some of their previous religious power to be curtailed, and really specifically abbesses. There really ends up being the suspicion of having abbesses that are too powerful, and we also think sometimes abbesses and female monasteries will lose power because really women were not able to say the mass, and so They no longer got the funds that would have gone to them just for prayers, because they could not say the Mass. Women would be excluded from some of the opportunities of the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, because they could not fulfill some of the basic things that friars could do, like, for instance, wander outside of monasteries, go to other places to preach or to convert people. And in fact, women in this period who got power through religion would often, one of the few avenues open to them was through mysticism. So, for instance, we've seen Catherine of Siena, another of these mystics, is shown here, Hildegard of Bingen. And these are just some of the images of some of these very florid visions that she would have of God. And people like Hildegard claimed a direct personal relationship with God. And this, of course, could circumvent the church's authority. And unlike many of male mystics who really spent a lot of time talking about how God was completely unknowable, sometimes referred to as a great cloud of unknowing, that really there was a chasm between humans and God. Female mystics would say, in essence, that of course God is knowable, that they felt they had these very sort of intimate, close relationships, that they knew God, that they could really be very close to Him, and they didn't see any problem with this. But in some cases, people felt that this attempt to grow so close to God and gaining authority through these means could make them make people resent them, or in fact, in some cases, suspect them of heresy. Altogether, we do think also that in the secular sphere during this time, institutions tended to become more centralized. We've seen kings become more powerful, and really, as a whole, this tends to squeeze out women who would have benefited from the more chaotic political conditions of the early Middle Ages. So, for instance, as city governments begin to grow, women are entirely excluded. Women are excluded from the administrations of kings. Really, in essence, most noble women continue to be used as pawns to seal strong marriages, but not much else beyond that. The last of the three periods that I'll focus a little bit on is the period from around the year 1300 to around the year 1500. And what we see here is that in the later Middle Ages, there are all sorts of new intellectual theories that come in that really begin to have again, at least a pseudo-scientific argument of why women are inferior. And in fact, they would stress the physical aspect of women's inferiority. Women were naturally supposedly weaker and physically colder than men, that they actually give off less heat. Women's genitals also were seen to be the mirror image of men's, and in fact, as a result of that, lower than men's genitals. They were inferior. And some would actually even extend these biological arguments, such as they were, to claim that women should also have societal inferiority. As we'll see later on, one of the most striking developments of this period was the Black Death. And this, of course, was not a disease that knew gender. In fact, all societies suffered during this time period. Some of the data we've analyzed, however, about gender differentiation, especially from the Italian city of Florence, tends to suggest that there was a skewed ratio of men over women in terms of survival rate. And it's at least possible that in times of disaster, that there was more infanticide and abandonment of girl children, and this tends to hit women harder on the whole. We, as we'll see later on, in fact, the Black Death would actually have an important part in Western Europe in challenging social hierarchy, but not gender hierarchy. So, for instance, women will continue to earn just about the same percentage of wages as opposed to men as before the plague. They didn't actually gain any ground, which is not the same with classes structure. The positions of public authority continued to be held by men afterwards. And really, women were still largely excluded from guild culture, even when there were fewer people running around altogether. This situation does not improve markedly with the Renaissance. And there are surely some women who benefited from the increased opportunities of the Renaissance to be able to, for instance, exercise patronage of famous artists. And we do know, in fact, there were some women who insisted on having their daughters educated along with their sons. It is fair to say that the Renaissance really, in some ways, would have passed most women by. It once was a famous article, did women have a Renaissance? And the answer is essentially no. And in fact, most of the society would not have had a Renaissance in the way that we're thinking of, where everyone begins to run out and start painting. It really, in some ways, people would even say that the Renaissance would tend to confine women to the domestic sphere because, the Renaissance needed all sorts of elite men to take part in the culture of the cities, and either in government or in war or producing artwork. But what that meant was, in fact, that men tended to absent themselves from the home, and someone had to stay at home with the children, and that was often the women. And altogether, we tend to think that the Renaissance had very little impact on populations other than a small group of urban elite men. Another very important part of the experience of women in this later period is the close connection really brought between women and witchcraft, and in fact, women and heresy, since there was not necessarily much difference in this period between heresy and witchcraft. From right around the 13th century on, all forms of magic, whether they were seen as beneficial or harmful, were seen to be inspired by the devil. And in effect, the Inquisition begins to hear cases involving magic, as well as ecclesiastical and secular courts as a whole. Many intellectuals began to feel that magic was all over the place, that there were devils, the devil was powerful in human affairs, and witchcraft was performed with the help of the devil. And really, there were at least some trials that claimed that the worship of the devil was going on, and again, dark sort of rituals like witches' Sabbaths. And altogether, the late Middle Age is not the period of greatest persecution of witches, but it begins to accelerate in the 15th century, especially places like France, Germany, and Switzerland. This sort of fear of magic and the devil acting through magic. It's often epitomized by the publication in 1486 of this work known as The Hammer of Witches, Malleus Maleficarum, by two Dominican friars and inquisitors, Henry Kramer and Joseph Sprengler. And they had a very sort of broad definition for what witchcraft was. Some cases, witchcraft was for them what in a previous generation would have been contemplated as herbal medicine, using certain plants in nature to try to heal people. In other cases, witchcraft could be things that caused people disease or bodily harm, sometimes with potions, sometimes with wax images of people. And this magic could be performed on people. It equally could be performed on people's livestock or the weather to just destroy crops on the whole. And the reason, of course, I'm speaking about this in general was that of all the people who get accused of witchcraft, that is often women, and in particular, not just any woman, but any women who had a bad reputation could find themselves being charged with witchcraft, and really women who lived on their own, widows, these sort of populations of women who were particularly vulnerable. And really, in some cases, we could even probably speak of mass hysteria toward the end of the Middle Ages. So, for instance, in the French city of Marmont in the year 1453, there had been an epidemic. And really, this is seen eventually to be the cause of witchcraft. And really, women begin to be questioned. And eventually, a mob will seize 11 other women then who were tortured and burnt at the stake. And as I mentioned to you earlier, it's not the Middle Ages that sees the greatest witch craze, but it's already beginning toward the end of the Middle Ages. This fear that's shooting around about witches. Altogether, really, there are a few women in this period who lead very autonomous, even and very influential lives. One of whom we'll see again is Joan of Arc. But again, I really caution you not to think of these women as the standard for all women in the Middle Ages. Women as a whole, still in this period, remain, societally speaking, firmly subordinate to men. And the women's greatest sphere of influence, too, in this period was still to their families and their households, not really directly out in the world on, for instance, a political level. Before I cap off, I wanted to talk about two medieval legends involving women, simply because in the past are the things that students have often asked me about, but neither of them really has any validity to them. The first of these is something known as the so-called Rite of the First Night, and this was a charge brought against the Middle Ages that supposedly, when a woman married, the noble lord in the region had the ability to spend the first night with her in bed before her husband did. This is a complete and utter fiction, often shown in even in the modern world. In, for instance, Braveheart, we see a variation of this. This never existed in the Middle Ages, and probably shows a lot more about the modern scholars who dreamt it up and their relationship to what they saw as a dark time in the Middle Ages, rather than anything about the Middle Ages itself. The second legend, which really is quite a bit more interesting about women in the Middle Ages, is the story of Pope Joan. And Pope Joan was a woman who was supposed to have occupied the papal see in male disguise in the 9th century. Now, let me stress from the beginning that this story is a complete fiction. The first traces that we can ever find of Pope Joan occur in the mid-13th century, although it is fair to say that during the later Middle Ages, there are even some people at the time who contemplated that it was a real event. It was not. Again, the reason this becomes so popular is in part, it's kind of a sort of a romantic story, and really in part because it brings into play this taboo that women, of course, cannot be priests or cannot have power generally. Although it is possible, too, that it originated as a satire of the general misuse of power of the church, which is a reason, by the way, I should say that in the Reformation, people tended to love this story as a whole, because it just showed what happens in the Roman Catholic Church. It's an example to them of the bad things that occur. With all that being said, here's the story. Around the year 850, a woman who was dressed as a man in order to remain close to her lover ended up entering the world of education, of studies. And in effect, she did so well in the realm of education that she actually was later on invited to come to Rome, allowed to enter the service of the Pope, and then in fact had gained such a reputation for learning and piety that when the old Pope died, she herself would end up being elected the new Pope, Pope Joan. Supposedly, this pontificate would last over 2 years, and then it was interrupted by scandal. Joan, supposedly, as the story goes, had not renounced the flesh. She ends up becoming pregnant, and then in the course of a procession from the Roman churches of St. Peter to the Church of St. John Lateran, she would end up giving birth to a child and then promptly dying. Really, the versions of this story of this memory of the female pope also created a sort of a sub-legend that, in fact, that supposedly when anyone was chosen as pope after that point, the gender of the person had to be manually verified. In fact, people took as proof these kind of chairs with holes that were not really used for those purposes. But again, this was all part of a very imaginative legend. But again, there is no validity to the story as a whole. All right, that's it. Thank you.